It was during my final year of high school, over spring break. I lived in a rural area with a small population. Due to low demand, the buses stopped running after 9 o'clock, creating a logistical nightmare for anyone needing to travel late into the evening. One particular evening, with my parents out of town visiting relatives, I found myself unusually bored and decided to visit a friend to pass the time. Hanging out with my friend was so much fun that I lost track of time. Before I knew it, it was approaching 9 p.m., the time when buses would no longer be running. I began contemplating whether to stay overnight at my friend's place. Walking home would take nearly 2 hours, and back then, mobile phones weren't as common. The only option was to use my friend's landline to call home. To my dismay, I discovered that my parents had returned earlier than expected. My father, a staunch conservative and already well aware of my troubled youth, got really angry upon learning of my plans to stay out late. He insisted that I come home right away, even if I had to walk. He was worried I might get into trouble again, recalling a previous incident, one that had only happened once, but had left a strong impression on him. The thought of facing his wrath was daunting. Being scolded by him was a whole different level of punishment. Reluctantly, I set out to walk home from my friend's place. It was around 9:30 by then. The rural roads were sparsely populated, and once you veered off the main roads, you were mostly surrounded by fields and vacant lots. The night was pitch dark, with streetlights spaced far apart, casting minimal illumination. The only light came from the moon, which did little to dispel the darkness, but I had to rely on it just to see what was ahead. As I walked nervously, trying to calm my nerves, I reached for the cigarette in my pocket to smoke, hoping to soothe myself, but I realized I had smoked my last one earlier. As I continued walking, wondering when I would finally reach home, I noticed a young woman standing under the dim glow of a distant streetlight, casually smoking. Desperate for a cigarette, I quickly approached her and asked, "Excuse me, could I borrow a cigarette?" She seemed to be about my age, or possibly 1 or 2 years older, and looked quite cute under the streetlight. Without hesitation, she pulled out a pack, took one out, and handed it to me. However, something felt odd. The cigarette she handed me was an old brand, the kind my grandfather used to keep in his drawer when I was a child. I had heard that the brand was discontinued a long time ago. Maybe the company had reintroduced it to revive a retro vibe, I thought. It was a bit surprising, but I took it anyway because I was desperate for a smoke. Wanting to chat a bit and feeling bored walking alone, I asked if I could accompany her. She agreed, and we walked together, lighting up our cigarettes. As we continued down the road, I couldn't help but ask, "Where did you get this old brand of cigarette?" She casually replied that she had taken it from her grandfather's drawer. I was amazed that her grandfather had preserved such a relic for so long, but I shrugged it off as we continued our conversation and walked together in the night. Our conversation flowed effortlessly, punctuated by her pleasant laughter. I found myself captivated by her charm, and before I knew it, we were nearing my home. From what I remembered, the girl had mentioned that she was living with her grandmother near our house. There was a kind of old-world grace about her, something timeless and enchanting. On impulse, I asked if I could see her again the next day, and she smiled, agreeing without hesitation. With a goodbye, we parted ways, leaving me with a sense of excitement for our next meeting. The next day, filled with anticipation, I set out to visit the grandmother's house she had mentioned. However, when I arrived, only her elderly grandmother was there. I politely asked, "Excuse me, I'm looking for your granddaughter. Is she around?" I introduced myself and explained our meeting the previous day, mentioning that she had said she lived nearby with her grandmother and had given me directions to this place. However, her reaction was not what I had expected. The grandmother looked puzzled and said that she had been widowed at a very young age and had lived alone ever since, without any children, let alone a granddaughter. Confused, I insisted, "But I met her yesterday, and she said she's your granddaughter." I tried to explain further, describing her appearance and recounting details of our encounter. This seemed to unsettle the grandmother, who excused herself momentarily and returned with an old weathered photo album. Looking visibly flustered, with a cautious expression, she opened the album, her hands trembling slightly as she carefully retrieved a faded black and white photograph. She hesitantly held it out to me and asked if the girl in the picture was the one I was talking about. Taking the photograph, I looked closely. It was an old, faded black and white picture taken around the 1960s or 70s, long before I was even born, showing a young girl. It was unmistakably her, the same facial features, the same gentle smile, the girl I had met the previous day. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized it was indeed her. The grandmother then cautiously began to speak. At that time, she was just 18 years old, and her close cousin was only a year younger. One day, her younger cousin came to visit her at home. Back then, there were many shops around, and they decided to go to the supermarket. Afterwards, while crossing the street, her cousin was suddenly hit by a truck and killed. The accident left the entire family in a state of shock, especially the old lady, as they were as close as real sisters. The person in the photograph was her younger cousin, who had died in that accident. I stared at the photograph, feeling an overwhelming sense of unease. The laughter, the conversation, her presence, it had all felt so real, so alive. Yet here I was, holding a picture of a girl who had been dead for over 50 years. The reality of what had happened began to sink in, and I was left speechless, my mind swirling with a mixture of disbelief and chills. As the old lady recounted the memory, her voice trembled with emotion.
Oh my, I need to collect myself. Come to think of it, yesterday was her anniversary.
Realizing how she had lived all these years without commemorating such occasions, she seemed saddened, murmuring that she should have prepared a memorial in her cousin's honor. Seeing the old lady tear up made me feel somewhat awkward and out of place. I felt uncomfortable, unsure of what to say or do. I quietly said goodbye and slipped away. The experience left me with a mix of emotions, a profound sadness for the grandmother and her cousin, and an unsettling chill that crept up my spine as I walked away. However, what lingered in my mind afterward was a peculiar memory that I couldn't shake. If the girl I had encountered was indeed the spirit of the grandmother's deceased cousin, it made me wonder about that cigarette we had shared. I recalled the moment vividly, how we had stood in a shadowed alley, puffing. The taste of that old brand lingered in my mouth even now, sharp and familiar, yet almost otherworldly. It was a brand my grandfather used to smoke, one I had heard was discontinued long ago, and yet there it was. The more I thought about it, the more curious I became. If I could somehow get hold of that old brand and try it again, I could confirm that the encounter was real. Or would it prove that it was all just a figment of my imagination? But then, if it was just my imagination, how was I able to get the directions and find her place?